Welcome to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm your host, Michael Sirmon. Every episode, we'll spend a few minutes exploring the challenges, questions, and realities of everyday life, because success means little if you lose yourself in the process. So take a breath, settle in, and let's spend a few minutes exploring life together. Some of the most dangerous things we allow into our lives don't get there because we think they're harmless. Sometimes we see the warning signs perfectly clear. In fact, we let them get close anyway because we're convinced we can handle them. Now, in January 1933, Germany's political leaders faced exactly that kind of decision. Adolf Hitler wanted to become chancellor, but President Paul von Hindenburg had resisted appointing him. Hitler's Nazi party was the largest party in Germany, but it didn't have the majority, and some of the conservative leaders surrounding Hindenburg didn't trust Hitler at all. They were pretty smart, right? They knew he was ambitious, and they also knew that his movement, the Nazi Socialist Party, could be dangerous. And honestly, that's what makes what happened next very interesting, because instead of keeping Hitler away from power, they decided to bring him closer, right? Former Chancellor, what's his name, Franz von Papen, I think, helped convince them that Hitler could be made chancellor and then be surrounded by experienced conservative leaders who would keep him under control. Papen would be vice chancellor, Hindenburg would remain president, and only a few Nazis would initially be in the cabinet. They knew there was a risk, but they believed they could control it. They were wrong. Welcome back to the Lead Well, Live Whole podcast. I'm Michael Sirmon, and today I want to talk about something that reaches far beyond a political decision made almost a century ago. I want to talk about the things we knowingly allow into our lives because we're convinced we'll be the ones controlling them. Because what happened in Germany in 1933 wasn't simply that a group of political leaders failed to recognize a dangerous man because they did recognize him, right? They recognized the danger. Their mistake was believing they were strong enough, smart enough, wise enough to manage it. When Hitler was appointed chancellor on January 30th, 1933, the people who helped put him there had reason to believe that their plan would work. Right? Hindenburg remained president and possessed considerable constitutional authority. Papen became vice chancellor, and most of the cabinet positions went to conservatives rather than Nazis. Hitler didn't have a majority in the Reichstag, and the established political leaders believed Germany's institutions would place boundaries around what he could do. On paper, Hitler looked contained. But they made a terrible miscalculation. They were looking at the power they already possessed while Hitler was looking at the access he had just been given. They thought they were bringing him close enough to control him, but what they actually did was bring him close enough to reach the controls. So within weeks, the political landscape began changing dramatically. Following the Reichstag fire, emergency powers were used to suspend fundamental civil liberties and suppress political opposition. Then came the Enabling Act, which allowed Hitler's government to make laws without the normal involvement of Parliament. So over the months that followed, competing political parties disappeared. Independent labor unions were destroyed. State governments were brought under Nazi control. And institutions that were supposed to constrain Hitler were either eliminated or subordinated to him. The men who thought they could use Hitler discovered that Hitler had been using them. Now, I want to be careful here because nothing in our ordinary lives should be casually compared with the horrors that eventually came from Nazi Germany. That's not the comparison I'm making. What interests me is the assumption underneath that original decision, because that assumption is much more familiar. We make smaller versions of this all the time. We've entered into relationships while recognizing things that concerned us and told ourselves it would probably work out. Right? We've gone into business with someone despite questions about their character because the opportunity looked too good to pass up. We've stayed around people who consistently bring out something unhealthy in us because we believe we're mature enough not to be influenced by them. We've made a small ethical compromise because we're certain we know exactly where the line is, and we would never cross that next one. And maybe it's not another person at all. Maybe it's a habit we keep around because we can stop whenever we want. Maybe it's an environment we know isn't particularly good for us, but we tell ourselves we can handle it. Maybe it's something we consume every day that continually leaves us angry, anxious, jealous, or even discouraged. Yet we keep returning to it because we don't think of it as having any real authority over us. Different situations, but underneath them was often the same assumption. I will influence this more than it influences me. And the more I've thought about that, the more I've come back to the passage of Scripture that I've heard quoted most of my life. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, it says, "Be ye not unequally yoked with unbelievers." And most of the time when I've heard that verse discussed, the conversation is centered around marriage and dating. And believe me, there's certainly wisdom in applying it there. Who you choose to build a life with matters enormously. But I think if marriage is the only place we allow this passage to speak, that we may miss something much bigger in the image that Paul chose. Think about what a yoke actually does. A yoke doesn't simply put two animals near one another. It connects them so that they have to move together. Once they're yoked, the movement of one affects the other. If one pulls left while the other wants to go right, both of them feel the tension. If one is considerably stronger or more determined about where it wants to go, the other animal can't simply pretend the connection isn't there. They aren't merely standing beside one another anymore. Their direction has become connected. And that distinction matters because I don't think Scripture is telling us to isolate ourselves from everyone who believes differently from us. Jesus certainly didn't live that way. He spent his time with people whose lives looked very different from his. He ate with people the religious establishment wanted nothing to do with. He moved toward people others avoided. He loved people who didn't have everything figured out. And we're supposed to love people like that. But loving someone and yoking yourself to them are two very different things. You can love someone deeply without giving them authority over the direction of your life. You can work beside someone without making them your business partner. You can listen to someone without making them your counselor. You can have a relationship with someone who sees the world differently without allowing their values to become the compass by which you make your decision. The question isn't simply who's in my life. The better question for us is who has a hand on my direction? Maybe we should broaden that question even further because people aren't the only things we can become yoked to. Sometimes we're yoked to approval. We tell ourselves we don't really care what other people think, but then when somebody criticizes us, it occupies our mind for the next 3 days. And before long, we're making decisions not because they're right, but because we're afraid someone might be disappointed in us. And we don't always have to know that person. I mean, one of my daily devotionals, I got a comment from a random stranger that talked about how well fed I looked, right? And I'm comfortable with who I am, but that made me pause and think. And I actually hesitated the next morning before I went to record the video. And I considered not doing a video of me speaking to it. And this is just a 90-second, daily devotional that I put out. Now, if you think of that impact, that influence that a complete stranger potentially had, and you apply that to every other area of our lives, how disconnected are we from that approval that we receive? Right? And sometimes we're yoked to ambition. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to accomplish something meaningful. There's nothing wrong with working hard about building something, about providing for a family, or even using the gifts God has given us. But ambition can quietly change roles in our lives. Sometimes, ambition begins as a servant, but can eventually become the master. At first, we're looking for success, and eventually we need success to tell us we're enough. I've told you before, right? My dad left when I was young, and a child's identity, a son's identity, comes from the father. So I did not have that identity as a child. So I looked for titles, I looked for positions, I looked for success to tell me that I was enough, to tell me who I was. And once that cycle starts, success really isn't something we're pursuing anymore. It then begins to develop and change our direction. The same thing happens with money. We begin by wanting enough to provide security for a family. But somewhere along the way, enough becomes a number that keeps moving further away. We can become yoked to our resentment, right? Someone hurt us 5 or 10 or 20 or 40 or 90 years ago. And even though they may not have a part in our life anymore, what they did continues to influence our relationships and decisions when they're not even around to see it. In fact, most of the time, they didn't realize they did it. Or if they did, they don't remember it now. Right? We can become yoked to fear. We can become yoked to our phones. We can become yoked to social media or political outrage or recognition or comfort or the endless need to know what everyone else is saying and doing. But you know what? We can even become yoked to an old version of ourselves. Right? Maybe people have known us a certain way for so long that we're afraid of change. Maybe we've built an identity around being successful, around being needed, about being strong, about being the person who always has the answer, being the one everyone can depend on, being the workout guy, the healthy eating guy, right? All of these things. But even when God begins to call us towards something different, because we are yoked to that identity of who we are, we keep dragging that identity along because, honestly, we don't know who we'd be without it. And the difficult thing about all these yokes is that they rarely take control of our direction overnight, right? Usually we invite them close because we believe we could manage the relationship. So that's why I think one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves isn't always, is this bad? Right? Because that's easy to answer. Yes, it's bad. No, it's not bad. And what I've realized, though, is that life isn't always divided in obvious categories of good and bad. So for me, the much better question is, what happens to me if I stay connected to this? Who do I become if this stays in my life? Right? Who am I becoming because of the relationship? What happens to my character when I'm around these particular people? What happens to my peace when I consume this content every day? What happens to my priorities when I chase this particular version of success? What happens to my marriage when work continually receives the best part of me and my family receives whatever happens to be left? What happens to my faith when the loudest voice in my life consistently pull me away from what I say I believe? Those aren't questions rooted in fear. I think they're actually questions about direction, which are rooted in wisdom. And maybe, really that's the part of the wisdom in the image that Paul chose, right? Because you don't necessarily discover that two animals are poorly matched while they're standing still beside one another. The problem becomes apparent when they begin trying to go somewhere together. Because life has a way of making us move, and eventually a decision has to be made. Pressures arrive, money gets tight, someone becomes angry, and opportunity appears. A relationship becomes difficult, and values, well, they get tested, and priorities often collide. And that's when we discover what actually has a hand in our direction. It's also where I think we need to be careful about making another mistake. Setting boundaries doesn't mean we stop loving people, because sometimes we confuse love with access. We think that if we really love someone, they should have unlimited access to our time, our emotions, our decisions, or our life. And if we create a boundary, we begin to feel guilty. We wonder whether we're being selfish or maybe judgmental. But if you think about it, Jesus loved people without allowing everyone to determine his direction. There were crowds he walked away from. There were demands he didn't meet. There were people he loved who still made choices he didn't follow. So love doesn't require that we surrender our direction. We can love someone and still say no. In fact, healthy love says no when appropriate. You can forgive someone and still establish boundaries, right? Because forgive isn't the same as forget. You can pray for someone and still recognize that they shouldn't be one of the primary voices shaping your decision. You can care deeply about someone without following them down a road you already know you shouldn't be on. And sometimes the boundary that we need is not with another person. Sometimes the boundaries are with ourselves. There are things we don't need to bring closer just to prove we're strong enough to handle them. In fact, we were talking yesterday on the back patio about the people who are into the extreme pain that let these things bite them or sting them or whatever just to see how much pain they can handle and how many times they get rushed to the hospital afterwards, right? They want to test themselves. They're tempted to prove who they are by what they can endure. There are temptations we don't need to test ourselves against. There are opportunities where the money isn't worth what accepting them will require us to become. I've turned down roles before because it would require me to do something that was not in my character or in my life choices. There are rooms we don't need access to, voices that really don't deserve to have influence in our lives. There's habits we don't need to negotiate with and compromises that aren't made safer simply because we've promised ourselves that we'll only make them once, right? Sometimes wisdom isn't proving how close we can stand to something without being changed by it. Sometimes wisdom is recognizing where the road leads and deciding that's not the direction we're going. And that brings me back to those political leaders in Germany of 1933. They weren't foolish, because they couldn't see the danger. They saw the danger. They weren't inexperienced men. They understood government. They understood politics. They understood the institutions surrounding them. They believed those institutions were strong enough and they were experienced enough to manage the risks they were taking. And their mistake wasn't simply that they underestimated Hitler. Their mistake was they overestimated themselves. And maybe that's the part of this history that should challenge us the most, because sometimes the greatest danger isn't ignorance, it's confidence. It's knowing something could hurt us and believing we're too strong to be hurt by it. It's knowing someone's pulling us in another direction and believing that we'll always be the stronger influence. It's knowing a habit is becoming unhealthy and believing we can stop whenever we decide to. It's knowing that something is slowly taking our peace and continuing to give it access because we don't want to admit that it has more influence over us than we intended. And maybe one of the most mature things we can ever say is, I don't need to prove that I can handle this. Right? In Back to the Future, to get Marty McFly to do something stupid, all they had to do was call him a coward, call him chicken, dare him, and he would jump out and do something stupid, and it would destroy whatever was happening until they finally matured enough to make the choice not to do this, not to rise to the bait. So this week, I think it may be a good opportunity to look around your life, not suspiciously and certainly not fearfully, but honestly, with your eyes wide open. Think about the people. Think about the relationships, your ambitions, your habits, who has influence on you, what has influence on you, and commitments that have become connected to your direction. And if you ask yourself or say to yourself from time to time, I don't even know who I am anymore, or this doesn't feel right, then that really is a good opportunity to stop and say, who has a hand on your direction? What has a hand on your direction? What have you allowed close because you believed you can control it? And maybe, most importantly, is it helping you become the person God is calling you to become? Or have you slowly begun adjusting your direction to accommodate it? Yes, we should love generously. We should love wholly and completely. We should serve people freely. We should be willing to sit at tables with people who don't look like us, think like us, vote like us, believe like us, or have their lives completely figured out, right? That's not what it means, or that's part of what it means to follow Jesus. But we should also choose our yokes carefully, because not everyone who deserves your love deserves influence over you. Not every opportunity deserves a yes. Not every voice deserves access to your mind. And not everything you believe you can control needs to be brought close enough for you to find out. Because maybe you can't. And sometimes the greatest danger isn't that we fail to recognize that something could influence us. Sometimes we recognized it perfectly well. We just believed that we were strong enough and that we'd be the ones doing the influencing. So, this week, take the opportunity to step back, quiet your hearts, quiet your minds, and allow yourselves to feel the tensions, to recognize the influences, and then make the decision. Is this in your best interest? Is it not in your best interest? And place the appropriate guards in place. So until next time, lead well, live whole. If today's conversation raised a question you've been wrestling with, I'd love to help. I offer one-on-one coaching for individuals navigating pressure, transition, and important decisions. You can learn more at michaelsirmon.com.